Let's start off with talking about water. So what is the chemical formula for water? I'm sure most of you are familiar with it. H2O, 2 hydrogen atoms, and an oxygen atom. Earth is covered by water quite a bit, 71% of the planet. In fact, the vast majority of that being in the oceans. By volume, so amount of space occupied, 97% of water on the planet is found in the oceans. So the vast majority of the planet's water is salt water, and it's found in oceans and connected seas. 2% is found frozen in the polar ice caps, getting smaller each year. And less than 1% is found in freshwater lakes and streams and such. And a huge chunk of that is just in the Great Lakes. So the water we have here in our reservoirs and rivers and streams, very, very tiny percentage of the total volume of water on the planet. Very, very small percentage. So just some fun pictures here. Pictures I took, actually. One on the right is in Monterey, California, and I think it's San Diego, California, one of the two. This one is Lake Erie. So we have fresh water, which is less than 1% of volume, and then we have salt water, part of the 97% of water found in ocean environments. So, global exchange of water. Water is not static, it is very dynamic. Hydrologic cycle is the name given to the global movement of water. We are not going to spend much time talking about that. The term reservoir, in this context, it's broader than you might think of it. It includes anywhere that has water, even for a short amount of time. So in the middle of the woods where there's water that forms after a very rainy couple of days, that is a reservoir based on the ecological definition. And so we've got our little reservoir drawn right here. Water enters and exits reservoirs through precipitation, evaporation, and flow. So let's start with water entering a reservoir. We just mentioned that even that little pond in the woods is considered a reservoir. It forms typically due to high amounts of precipitation. Now, water might stay in that little pool, or it might ultimately leave the pool through exit flow. So those are a couple of mechanisms. Also, entry flow may increase the volume of water in that reservoir too. Water, ultimately, if there's a dry spell after this, that pool might dry up due to water loss in the form of evaporation. Of course, water that evaporates eventually will condense into cloud vapor, which, when it cannot hold onto that water, releases it as precipitation. That's the long and short of the hydrologic cycle. We are not going to talk too much about that. The sun ultimately drives it, just as the sun drives much of the widespread phenomena that we observe in terms of climate. But this is just a very simple look at the term reservoir and then the movement of water in and out of the reservoir through precipitation, evaporation, and flow. Let's get into the marine environment. When I grew up, there were 4 oceans. There are now 5. Oceans cover 360 million square kilometers. If we say 71% of the Earth's surface is covered with water. The oceans are the Pacific, Atlantic, Indian, and Arctic. These are the 4 that I grew up with. Pacific, largest ocean, here. Atlantic, Indian Ocean, Arctic Ocean. So what is the new one? What is the 5th one? I don't think anything's changed geographically since I was younger. Well, the Southern Ocean is now considered its own separate thing. That is the ocean surrounding Antarctica. It has a lot of unique species that are found there, and it has a lot of dynamic to it that is unique from the, for instance, Indian Ocean, Pacific, and Atlantic Oceans neighboring it. And because of that uniqueness, it is now considered its own ocean. We are not going to go into the specifics of what makes it unique, that would take too long. But the Southern Ocean is now considered the fifth ocean, and it borders Antarctica. What's the difference between an ocean and a sea, by the way? Right? I know you've heard of both terms, but seas, we think they're smaller, right? Smaller and partially surrounded by land. So the oceans are much larger, seas are smaller, seas are partially surrounded by land. Some of the more famous ones, Mediterranean, Baltic, Red Sea. Right? So seas partially enclosed by land, but ultimately most seas are still connected to the ocean and are also salt water. In terms of looking at ocean structure, there are a couple of ways to divide it. One way is to divide the ocean structure horizontally and look at it that way, which we will do here on the board. So, that is the sea floor. There's our surface of water. And over here we got dry land. Okay. So, horizontal zonation, going from land out. First thing we'll have is right here. So, we're going to say this is high tide right now. During high tide, the water is as far up inland as it's going to be. During low tide, the water will retreat and expose the intertidal zone, which is the space between high and low tide. So the intertidal zone is also called the littoral zone, but I usually use the term intertidal. This is the area subjected to shifting tides. You can see a picture here of a sea star among many other species that are adapted to that environment of change, because you have to be able to survive in either very, very small isolated pools or survive exposure to the air if you're going to be able to live in such a dynamic changing area. And so the intertidal zone between high and low tides. The neritic zone is the next zone. And in this picture, it would be right here. So the neritic zone is permanently submerged. There is no period of time where it is actually exposed, as we have with the intertidal zone. But it's comparatively shallow, at least compared to the open ocean that covers much of the planet. The neritic zone extends from the end of the intertidal zone, so basically where the water meets the land at low tide, from here to the end of the continental shelf where there's a steep drop-off in depth. That's the neritic zone. It is comparatively shallow to the deep open ocean, right? And this is where you have a large amount of life that exists in the ocean can be found here. Coral reefs are found here, kelp forests are found here. Many species make their home in the neritic zone. It gets light exposure that is not seen in the deep ocean. So that's the neritic zone. The oceanic zone then would be everything else beyond the continental shelf. So this is the continental shelf right here. Everything out here beyond it is the oceanic zone. What about looking at ocean structure vertically? Let's do that. Let's take a look at ocean structure from a vertical perspective. have to do another drawing. So I've magnified things a bit. This right here is just this part. So starting at the surface, the epipelagic zone, 0 to 200 meters. So 0 meters at the surface, 200 meters here. A meter is somewhat similar to a yard, so we're talking about 600 feet. 0 to 600 feet. Right? In the epipelagic zone, this is where you have plankton, like we see here, that floats with the ocean currents. It's where you've got obviously the greatest light penetration, and since those plankton, a lot of them conduct photosynthesis, they have to be up here to get adequate sunlight. Mesopelagic zone is going to be the next zone down from 200 to 1,000. I'm not sure that my picture up here is going to really be very much to scale. Just apologize for that. Mesopelagic ultimately is where we have loss of available light. It is very dark even midway through this zone, which we'll talk about later. By the time we get to the bottom of this zone, it is by our standards pitch black. Bathypelagic is 1,000 to 4,000. Like I said, this is not, it's not unfortunately the most to scale. You know what? I don't like that. Let's fix that. So, epipelagic up here, 200 meters. This is the epipelagic. This is the mesopelagic. Bathypelagic, 1,000 to 4,000. This is much more to scale. Bathypelagic is dark. Many fish in this zone show bioluminescence, which is producing their own form of light, which is quite incredible to observe. If you've ever gone to an aquarium, they will have some bioluminescent organisms. Fish, jellyfish, various other groups of organisms as well. Abyssal zone is 4,000 to 6,000. Sometimes it's called abyssopelagic. We're just going to call it abyssal zone. And the hadal zone is anything 6,000 meters and below. Again, midway through the mesopelagic, it's dark. And so much of the open ocean is going to be dark. And if you don't like my picture, over there, here's another one that shows, and this is not really to scale either, but this shows you the oceanic divisions moving down. It also shows you the intertidal or littoral zone, and then the neritic. You can see the continental shelf extending out. Again, much of the life we observe in the ocean lives in that neritic zone. So we talked about light availability. Let's go into that a little bit more. Vast majority of sunlight is observed in the first 10 meters of water. It's about 30 feet. And so if you are an organism that uses the sun to produce your organic material, produce your food, you're going to have to be pretty close to the surface of the ocean. So yeah, most photosynthetic organisms have to live within 10 meters. Coral reefs are going to be generally shallower than 10 meters or 30 feet by and large. If you're curious, this is called a parrotfish. It scrapes algae. It scrapes algae in reefs, so it's a very very colorful species. We'll talk more about them later in the semester. The reason why things look blue underwater, by the way, is because blue light is the least rapidly absorbed color of the spectrum. So you have visible light, and different wavelengths of visible light correspond to different colors. The wavelengths that correspond to blue are the least rapidly absorbed in water, which causes us to perceive things under a certain depth as blue. Under 50 or 60 meters, most things are going to look blue to us. In the shallower areas, it's not noticeable yet, the discrepancy in absorption between the different colors of light. By 600 meters, which is right here, in the middle of the mesopelagic, light is equivalent to a clear night on Earth, so it's pretty dark at this point. Here's a bioluminescent comb jellyfish. I believe it's a jellyfish of some sort. I believe it's a comb jellyfish. But you can see how it produces its own light, which is really, really interesting to me. I do not know too much about bioluminescence. Let's talk a little bit about temperature. Warm water is less dense than cool water, and so if you have both warm and cold water, warm water is going to float on top of cold water. In tropical areas, what we see is what's called stratification, thermal or temperature stratification. This is what temperature looks like in a tropical oceanic environment. You have a warm surface layer, an area of rapid temperature change called the thermocline. And then you have the deep zone where it's very cool. And you can see cool temperatures until we reach the thermocline, around 400 meters. And then we have that warm surface layer of water. This is observed in lakes as well. So it's any body of water, really. In temperate climates, for instance, if you were to go to New York and you were to observe the temperature of the water in the Atlantic Ocean off of New York, it would depend on what season you go in. In fall, after this stratification happens during the long summer months, right? So right now, you might observe this. But in fall, ultimately, cool outside temperatures cool down the surface layer, and the whole thing ultimately breaks down, and there's a temporary uniformity in temperature in temperate areas. And so the seasonality affects water temperature in the oceans quite a bit. But in tropical areas, you tend to see this almost consistently year-round. Water does change temperature, but it generally does it more slowly than you might expect because of something called hydrogen bonding. I'll show you. Here's a water molecule, 2 hydrogens and an oxygen. We're not going to talk about how this happens, but water has a charge to it. Negative charge for the oxygens, positive for the hydrogens. So if there's 2 water molecules together, there's a bond between them, between the positive hydrogens and the negative oxygens. That's called a hydrogen bond. And basically, you need a lot of heat to be able to break that apart and speed up the molecules and warm up the water. And so water does not quickly change temperature because the molecules don't speed up that quickly because a lot of heat has to go into breaking apart the hydrogen bonds. Long story short, water resists temperature change pretty well. However, it does still change. And in temperate areas, that's primarily due to seasonality. Some other things, salinity, amount of salt dissolved in water. We all know the ocean is salt water, but what exactly is the concentration of salt in this water? It is 34 to 36 grams per kilogram. Grams per kilogram. not the easiest thing to say, and so what do we say instead? We say parts per thousand, or PPT, which makes sense because a kilogram contains 1,000 grams. So the salinity of the ocean is 34 to 36 PPT, parts per thousand. I've got a picture of a sockeye salmon here. Why is that there? Because salmon are one fish species that is able to tolerate the salinity of the ocean and the complete lack of salt in fresh water. So what salmon do is they spawn or reproduce in streams and then die right after they reproduce. Those eggs hatch. Those salmon, ultimately the offspring, will swim out of that stream out into the ocean, where they will grow and develop until they reach an age of reproduction, and then go back up that same stream and do the whole thing again. So salt in the ocean, 34 to 36 parts per thousand. Oxygen availability is another important thing. So in the air, oxygen is much more readily available than in water. Usually, we don't worry too much about available oxygen, but we do notice differences. If you go to the Rocky Mountains in Colorado and you try running at an elevation of 7,000 feet, you probably will notice that it's harder to run than it is to run here, where we're not, I don't know exactly what our elevation is here. It's around 1,000, I think, 1,000 feet elevation. So we notice differences based on elevation, but still with water, oxygen availability, it's much lower than in the air. Okay? In air, there's 200 milliliters of oxygen per liter of air. There's 1,000 milliliters in a liter, so about 20% of the volume, roughly. There's 9 milliliters of oxygen per liter of water on average, and this really varies. Cold water tends to have greater oxygen availability than warm water, and the amount of algae in the water can really influence oxygen availability, because when algae dies, bacteria break it down, they consume oxygen, they can use up all of the oxygen or most of the oxygen in an area, and fish can die from lack of oxygen. So oxygen availability, it varies quite a bit. In oceans, massive blooms of algae can kill large numbers of fish. About a year ago, I think, in Florida, there was it's called a red tide, because the microorganism that causes it gives a reddish appearance to the water. It's ultimately led to that, the red tide was ultimately a massive bloom of this microorganism, choked out a lot of fish, and there was die-offs along the coast of Florida with fish because there wasn't enough oxygen. Okay. Let's talk about something called primary production. If you remember production from the last lecture, we talked about producing something. It was plants, right? Converting CO2 into sugars. Voila, they produced sugars. That was the idea. So it's not just plants. It can be anything capable of doing photosynthesis. Of course, we think of plants as being the ones that do this because on land, they're the primary ones that do. But it also includes photosynthetic algae that float with ocean currents. And little algae in the ocean. However, they do need the sun just like plants do. Photosynthesis requires sunlight, and organisms that conduct photosynthesis can only do it where the sunlight is adequate, and that is up here near the surface of the ocean, epipelagic zone, only place where the sunlight penetration is great enough to allow them to photosynthesize. We talked about, or kind of talked about plankton. We didn't define it though, which I want to do. Plankton are defined as anything that moves with ocean currents. So plankton are organisms that move with ocean currents. Okay. They don't have to be small, but they usually are. And it includes a wide variety of species. A lot of larvae of marine species float. So certain jellyfish larvae might float, certain aquatic worm larvae might float. Echinoderms like sea stars and such. Larvae often are part of plankton. But one type of plankton is called phytoplankton. Phyto means plant, and so these aren't actually plants, but they do the same role. Phytoplankton are plankton that can do photosynthesis. They make their own food using the sun's energy. So here's a picture of some of them. They're small, but they have the mechanisms needed to produce sugars using the sun's energy. There's also predators that float with them, that eat them. They're called zooplankton. These are going to be plankton that are consumers. You might recognize zoo from the word zoo. It means animal. So if you actually break down the words, animal plankton, plant plankton. But most zooplankton aren't animals. Some are. But zooplankton is anything that floats with the ocean current that has to eat stuff to get energy. Right? Kind of like you do. Phytoplankton, anything that floats with the ocean's currents that makes its own food using photosynthesis, unlike you. So two different methods of getting the energy that they need, both of which float with ocean currents. So this is great for food webs and such that are near the surface of the ocean, but there's a lot of stuff in deep sea communities. So if photosynthesis is only happening near the surface of the water, how on earth is life existing in deep sea environments? There are two primary methods used by deep sea life to obtain the energy that they need without sun exposure being very adequate. Good chunk of species in the deep sea simply feed on stuff that falls down from the surface. That sounds like a good plan to me. Here's a picture of a dead whale. Whales especially, if they fall down to the substrate, the surface of the deep sea, they are quickly consumed, or not always super quickly, but they are quickly found and then feasted upon by a number of species. But that's how most things in areas beyond sunlight ultimately get their food. They just feed on stuff that floats down. Or some species during the night will go up closer to the surface and feed on stuff as well. So daily not migrations, but daily movements. But usually it's just feed on organic stuff that comes down. I don't think we've defined the word organic. We'll go ahead and do that. So if something is organic, if you think about it in everyday usage, you think of maybe healthy, locally grown, no pesticides, something like that. Biologically speaking, organic simply means that something has two elements. It has carbon and it has hydrogen. So carbon dioxide, the stuff that plants and algae convert into sugars, it is not organic. The sugars themselves typically have a chemical formula something like this. I see a C, I see an H. That looks organic to me. And And so plants and other photosynthetic organisms, they can take inorganic stuff, inorganic carbon like CO2, and convert it into organic stuff like sugars. You and I can't do that, so we have to eat ready-made organic material. So if you see the word organic showing up, that's what it's talking about. So most deep sea life eats organic stuff that floats down. But not all deep sea life does this. Certain bacteria are capable of oxidizing sulfur. We're not going to talk about the chemical complexities of that at all, but they can oxidize sulfur to make organic material without needing sunlight. So photosynthesis, going from CO2 to sugars, that needs the sun's energy. But what these bacteria can do is they can take a sulfuric compound spewing out from these vents at the bottom of the ocean, and they can convert inorganic material, and I believe it's still CO2, by the way. They can convert inorganic carbon into sugars, basically, into organic stuff. In this top picture is showing a community built around these bacteria. The bacteria actually live with these tube worms, okay? And they're the producers of their environment. The bacteria are, and they form the basis of this whole food web. You've got anemones, you've got fish species, you have crabs, you have all sorts of interesting organisms built around these bacterial producers, which can make organic stuff using sulfur compounds spewing out of vents, bottom of the ocean. It's called chemosynthesis, by the way. So photosynthesis, photo means light, so that requires sunlight. Chemosynthesis means you're using a chemical, sulfur compound, instead of light. Even though the general gist of it, which is making food, is the same. Awesome. So what environments do we see in the oceans? There are some cool marine biomes. If you remember back, I said that biome is usually used to describe environments, ecosystems on land. And that is true, but it does also occasionally get used to describe marine ecosystems. And so we're going to use it in this particular lecture. First marine biome is the kelp forests. These are really, really cool. Kelp can grow to several meters tall. They're like underwater trees. And they're only found in temperate areas. So if you go down to the tropics, you won't find these. The best place to see them is off the coast of California. Temperature can't get warmer on a regular basis than 20 degrees or else kelp will not grow. So that's about 70-ish degrees Fahrenheit. Kelp are really cool. They're actually not a plant. They're a type of algae, they're a type of brown algae that can do photosynthesis. But they don't have the properties that we see in plants. If you go south a ways, you'll find coral reefs. So coral reefs are found in tropical areas. They're the opposite of kelp in that temperature can't regularly go below 20 degrees. They also have to be shallower than kelp forest biomes. Kelp grow very, very tall. Coral needs to be present in an area where there is enough sunlight to allow for photosynthesis to occur. Remember, kelp grow very close to the surface of the water, even though they may actually be anchored quite deep. They're going to grow to the surface, and so they'll have ample sunlight, nearly as big as kelp. And so they need to have closer position to the surface. Some interesting facts about corals. They're actually animals. Corals themselves are animals, and animals can't do photosynthesis. There's no animal that can, as far as I know. There's one weird slug that has algae that grows in its back, and it's funky, but generally animals don't do that. So corals are animals, they don't conduct photosynthesis, and so how can a coral reef even exist? The corals are the producers, and yet they're not producing anything. It has to do with a symbiotic relationship that the corals have. See, corals, if I can spell, corals are mutualistic with algae called zooxanthellae. Zooxanthellae actually live with the corals. They are an algae that lives with the corals, and they are responsible for the bright color of the corals. They actually photosynthesize. Corals themselves don't. If you were to magnify corals, they look like really, really tiny sea anemones, many of them do. And one piece of coral usually consists of thousands of individual coral species. They're in the same group as anemones and jellyfish. They're called cnidarians. But they have a mutualistic relationship with the zooxanthellae, and that's what makes them colorful. And so corals themselves are the main producers in their coral reef environment, but it's not actually the coral animal that's doing the photosynthesizing, it's the algae that lives with them. When the algae go away, the corals become bleached. If you've ever seen videos of bleached coral, it's like a ghost town. It's just white coral after white coral. They're not dead, they just lost their symbiotic partner, and they will die if that happens regularly when they get bleached like that. We'll talk more about coral bleaching later on. A couple of things: coral reefs do not exist where there's a lot of river runoff, so they need to be in areas where you don't have a lot of that potential nutrient flow coming in from the river. And they are biodiverse. If you remember that from the last lecture, they have an incredible variety of life. The most biodiverse reefs are actually found in Indonesia, that area. We've also got some in the U.S. off the coast of the Florida Keys, down in the Caribbean area. But biodiversity is equivalent to rainforests. We're not going to talk about the mechanisms that cause the tides, but they are caused quite simply by the gravitational pull of the moon and the sun to a degree as well, but we're not going to talk too much about that. Organisms here are adapted, like I said, to a wide variety of conditions. Estuaries, these occur where rivers empty into the ocean. The next and last slide for this marine biomes part is going to show you what happens when fresh water coming from a river meets with salty water of the ocean. Estuaries occur where rivers empty into the ocean. The term for water that does not have the 35, roughly, parts per thousand salinity of ocean water, or the 0, roughly, parts per thousand water of fresh water is called brackish water. So this is water that is not truly fresh water, but it's not oceanic salt water either. And so when the waters mix, you get brackish water, and that occurs in estuaries. If you were to take the Mississippi River all the way down to Louisiana, where the Mississippi River empties into the Gulf of Mexico, that would be an example of an estuary. Salt marshes are another marine biome, a coastal biome. These occur in very shallow expanses in temperate areas. If you were to go along the northeast coast, if you were to go along the Gulf Coast, you would find massive expanses of salt marsh grasses. Lots of primary production happening, not a lot of plant diversity here. It's mostly just a few species, but there are a lot of individuals of those few species. Key with these guys is they're found in very shallow waters because the plants themselves are rooted to the submerged ground, but they still are emergent above the water. So salt marshes, very shallow, much more shallow, for instance, than the kelp forests. And then there's mangroves, which exist in shallow areas in tropical regions. Mangroves feature emergent trees, and so usually the root system of these trees provides a lot of nooks and crannies for several fish species. In the U.S., the only place you can find mangrove forests is in the Florida Keys and that general area. But yeah, so these are some coastal marine biomes. Speaking of estuaries, a little bit more on them. So this is an incoming river, fresh water. Salt water here, you can see you have it coming in, there's some upwelling, it comes back around. It does not mix immediately with the fresh water. Fresh water is less dense than salt water, and so it floats above salt water when they meet. And you can see here that it forms a separate layer above the salt water for quite a while, long after it's actually emptied out into the ocean. And so the diluting of fresh water into the 35 parts per thousand salinity of the ocean is quite gradual. And there's quite a bit of brackish water even a ways out from the actual river mouth itself. So that's what occurs in estuaries.